Welcome to today's episode of Voices for Care, where we delve into the pressing issues in education and childcare advocacy. Today we have Jeff Park, the Executive Director of the Alberta Parents Union, joining us. This organization is a dedicated group committed to ensuring that every child in Alberta has access to the best possible education, whether that be in public, Catholic, Francophone, alternative, charter, independent, or home education. In this episode, we'll explore the Alberta Parents Union's mission to empower parents with all the information and tools they need to help their children achieve their full potential. Jeff will share insights into their belief that education should not be one size fits all, but rather a diverse landscape that reflects the unique needs of each child. We'll discuss how the advocacy for a broad array of educational choices in Alberta correlates with the goals of childcare advocacy, emphasizing the importance of flexibility, innovation, and parental choice. Join us as we discuss this crucial role of parents in shaping an equitable and excellent education system that serves students first and foremost. Whether you're a parent, educator, or simply passionate about the future of our children, this episode is packed with valuable insights and practical advice. I am very grateful to have you here today, Jeff, from the Alberta Parents Union, and to be able to hear about your association, to hear what you're advocating for, and all the great work you're doing for parents and for children, and to bring better education across the province. So thank you very much for doing this. And I'll just open the floor for you to introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your association and what you guys do.
Sure. I run the Alberta Parents Union. We're a grassroots parents organization. We're relatively new ourselves. We just launched May 12th of 2022, so just over 2 years. But in that time, we've added over 30,000 parents who come to us for our information and advocacy around education in Alberta. Since education is a purely provincial jurisdiction that the federal government has not yet overreached into. So we're limited to Alberta because it's a purely provincial system. But throughout Alberta, we have just over 30,000 parents that are coming to us for their advocacy around education, whether that be in public, Catholic, Francophone, charter, alternative program, private, or what we sometimes call independent schools in Alberta, or home education. And now in Alberta, we have two versions of home education, the funded and the unfunded. And so we have people throughout all of those, though it's pretty representative of the student population in Alberta. Actually, the one place where I would say we definitely have less proportionally than the student population is in the Francophone system, because I parlez-vous not at all, and all of our communications are in English. And the Francophone system is not the French immersion system. It's not for English-speaking people who want to learn French. It's for French-speaking families. So that's not a place that we have yet branched out to communicate to, but so understandably a little light on that portion but otherwise pretty broadly representative of the student population in Alberta. In fact, maybe a little more heavy on the public system than the student population, which is interesting because we have attracted this grassroots coalition of parents based on a handful of commitments. One just being that parents are the real experts in their own kids. So there may be people more expert than me in curriculum design or in a certain kind of pedagogy or in teaching a certain subject, which was why it's totally fine for me to hire those people to do those things. But there's no one more expert in my 8, 6, 5, and 3-year-old than me, except on her very best days, their mother. And so putting parents in that driver's seat, recognizing parents' expertise in our own children, making sure that that's being respected. Parents are getting all the information about their child's education. Right now, our active campaign is fighting for assessments, because the Alberta Teachers Association, there have been a new and more straightforward assessment regime announced. The Alberta Teachers Association is pushing back against it. So our current campaign is to have those assessments so that parents have that kind of information. But we've done things around that with classroom transparency, all kinds of things like that. So that's the first commitment. The second is just that you only have to have a second child to realize that children are not one size fits all. So their education can't be either. Their childcare can't be either. I'm sure you see that in your space as well. So we can't settle for one size fits all options. We need more choice, more innovation, more competition, and that will result in a more flourishing sector in education. Because after all, in education, as in childcare, what we're paying for is for the child to be educated. That's what we're being taxed for, is for the education of the child, not for a certain sector to reign supreme over that. So we're looking for more choice in education, which is why I said it's interesting that we have a very heavily public school centered student population. We, for the most part, have public school families that support choice in education because they see that that's a rising tide that lifts all boats, that there's more access, more options, more competition, so more excellence in the sector when you allow for, the government pays, but you allow for all kinds of providers. And that's the system that and I guess since you have a more national audience, I should point out that is the system we mostly have in education in Alberta is more than the rest of Canada. BC and Saskatchewan are a little closer to us than other places, although Alberta is the only place that has charter schools. So, and there are some other distinctions where Alberta comes out ahead. But for the most part, if you don't live out west, you might not be aware that there could be a system where the money follows the child in education, regardless of the provider. But that is sort of, in essence, the system that we have in Alberta, with asterisks all along. And then the last reason I think that we've seen so much growth is our commitment to, and I've heard this from your group as well, that as a parent you also learn that even if it's not our fault, it's our responsibility. So if there's a problem, like it doesn't matter whose fault it is, which government brought this in, which government is as parents, even if the developments in the education system aren't our fault, they are our responsibility. They are ultimately our kids. We are responsible for them long after they graduate from anyone's particular classroom or any particular school. and so it's our job. It's our job to make sure that we're holding things to a high standard, advocating for high quality in the education system. So anyway, those are our three commitments, and I'll let you get away.
I mean, you are speaking my language in everything you're saying. I don't want to take over for childcare today because this is about your association and the work you're doing. I definitely see a lot of parallels in what's happening in our childcare sector in Alberta, but also across Canada. We are under, I will say, this is my opinion, under a hostile takeover of our sector from the government federally and somewhat provincially as well. And it's changing the landscape. And I think a lot of parents are really unaware of what's under the surface of a $10 a day childcare promise. And it's really not what you have been promised as parents. And this transformation of our childcare system is going to have massive results and a long-standing impact on our children. It's not going to be an easy cleanup or an easy fix. And I really am fearful that parents have not been transparently informed of what's coming. And we're just rolling through this because we, as a province, signed some really bad policy and took a lot of money from our federal government. And it's going to be on our children. And it's shameful, to be honest. I feel at this point that there's no lack of awareness now on the problems with this childcare system, and we're still continuing on. So, I hope that I hope that we can start to bring some more awareness. I hope that some of your parents who maybe have children in childcare will start to look at the values and what you guys are advocating for and try and see if it transfers into this childcare system that they're being promised, because I think it's falling very short. One of the things I did want to ask you, because what we're seeing a lot of right now is a decline in, say, registration into other programs outside of facility-based daycare. Because this $10 a day childcare program really only supports parents and spaces in full-time daycare. Day homes are left really short funded, so our preschools, out of school care, kinder care are all excluded from this $10 a day program, which makes it really difficult for parents to choose those programs because they can't afford to. And I know with preschools, we're seeing a huge decline. A lot of preschools are closing across the province because they just can't stay viable under this. It's hard to compete with a full-time daycare spot that actually costs the parents nothing. And then what I'm seeing is that kindergarten, I have overseen a center in a private school this year, a childcare center in a private school. And their kindergarten program was one of their probably fullest and like waitlisted programs for the whole school. It has been for years. My children go to this school and we chose it because of their kindergarten program originally. And this year their kindergarten was down, like I would say almost just off the top of my head, down probably 75% in enrollment. And I think a lot of schools maybe haven't made this correlation yet, that it's because of the $10 a day childcare program. Parents can't afford to put their children in kindergarten. They're leaving them in daycare. And what does that mean for grade one? Like, what is that transition going to look like for these children going from daycare to grade one? And how are teachers in the education system, which is totally separate from childcare and really doesn't communicate, going to be prepared to support those children in that transition? Have you heard anything around that? Do you see that?
Well, yes, absolutely. And there are a couple things. So absolutely, the the availability of a free option has definitely been one of those pressures. Another one would be that for a private or an independent school, they for the first time really in my time paying attention to education, which is a little over half my life, I think now, the private schools are having long wait lists of the type that we normally associate with charter schools. So I was listening to one of your previous episodes and hearing about how in Alberta you have a model that allows for private spaces to come online under the $10 a day program, sort of, but only up to a certain number. And that's basically how we've run our charter school system, which for those, again, if you're outside Alberta, you wouldn't have much of a context for this. A charter school is a public school that is not run by the public school board, but run by a private society. And but it has to take all students. It doesn't have a geographic boundary, but it has to either be first come first serve or a similarly equitable admissions process. And then for the first, what was it, years that we had charter schools, they were actually capped at 15 total charter schools for the entire province.
Okay, I didn't know that.
And that cap was lifted in 2020, but it's still because of the actual chartering process where they can come online, it's slow. It's a slow process for them to come online. So even though the cap was completely taken off in 2020, there are only, I think, 36, I think is the number, charter schools today, which is great that there are more. But this entire time, we had waiting lists that were about twice as long as the number of seats in a given charter school at every. That was across the entire set. And so it's unsurprising to me to hear that you have waiting lists of 200 at childcare centers, because that's the experience that we've had with charter schools when we have this sort of a capped rollout of a and it's a little different because they're not private per se, but they're privately managed, and not nonprofit, I think, would be the equivalent in in the terminology in childcare. But anyway, but now we're starting to have that with independent schools or with private schools. We're starting to see the kinds of waiting lists that we typically only associate with charter schools because we essentially had a cap on them. And the reason for that is because, again, you have enough regulation of private schools. I think people hear private school and they think it's a private school, i.e., it's the Wild Wild West. No, they have to fulfill all the same regulations, all the same financial reporting requirements. Financial reporting requirements are more difficult for a private school because they have more sources of revenue than just a transfer from the government, because the government does not. The government gives private schools about 65% of the per student funding that they give to public schools, and so the financial reporting requirements are actually more onerous. They're having to hire full-time staff to do administration, which typically the board had done in the past for a lot of these places. But anyway, so it's onerous to bring a new private school online.
Yeah.
And so we've started to see waiting lists at private schools. And since one of the regulations, or a couple of the regulations with private schools, have to do with scrutinizing who they're admitting and how long their waiting lists are, and are you trying to be in an elite private school and only let in certain people? And it's one of the things that they scrutinize in the regulatory process. A lot of private schools have eliminated their pre-K and some even their kindergarten because that you can artificially shrink your wait list that way.
Yeah.
And you're getting a little less scrutiny from the government, especially the pre-K. I've seen that happen a lot, where the pre-K has been eliminated because you can open up more space in your building and have those extra seats for K through 12 and get a little less scrutiny as to your waiting list. So this pinch is happening in multiple sectors at once. Alberta, in particular, has had more people move in with young families. So yeah, I think there is some interplay between the childcare and the education sectors here that's causing both to have these waiting lists and this lack of access more generally.
Yeah. Do you think that any of the increase in demand for private schools is maybe a reflection too of, and I don't want to criticize public schools, but of a failing public system? I know one of my previous roles was in behavior support in a public school system. And I mean, that was years ago, and there wasn't enough funding then, and there wasn't enough support. And I feel like even now, with my own children being in different school systems, class sizes are not even, I mean, it's astronomical, some of the class sizes in our public system. There's not enough funding to support the high needs of children. I know in childcare, we talk a lot about burnout because of just social emotional gaps coming through COVID. And I mean, that transfers into schools as well. I mean, we came out of a very traumatic time for our society without really any support for people of all ages, adults too, to deal with that trauma and that isolation. And I just wonder if parents are seeing maybe that their children need more support and they feel that a private option is better or can provide that for them.
Yeah, so that is some of it. So anecdotally, speech delays roughly quadrupled over the course of 2020 to 2022. The lots of other special needs, emotional dysregulation, all of these things have gone up, even in kids that weren't yet in the school system, which I think does reflect on maybe the effect that it had on the childcare system, maybe just the effect of, in general, the trauma that you're describing. But certainly it's well documented the effects that it's had on kids that were in school, but we're even starting to see some studies about kids that weren't yet in school. And that definitely, I mean, what I'm hearing from my members is that that's one of the big things driving. But it's also, I think, so Alberta has a high quality public system on standardized tests. We report back the international assessments that we participate in. So Alberta in 2022 finished second in the world in language arts, second in the world in science, and seventh in the world in math. And so that puts us in the top of Canada, except on math, where we're behind Quebec. And so Alberta has a very high quality system. I think that's largely because of our world-class choice in education and the accessibility, trusting parents to make the best decisions for their own kids, and making these things accessible and equitable in that way. You don't, for instance, have in Alberta, like you do in Ontario, a big income gap between people. In fact, the highest percentage, the system with the highest percentage of top quintile households in Alberta, the system that has the highest percentage of those households represented in its student population, is the public system, which makes some sense, because if you live in a wealthy neighborhood, a lot of times the public schools are good.
Right. Like, true. Yeah.
Right. It's because wealthy people are going to have more resources to advocate for the public schools to be good in their neighborhood, and you'll see that. So, but actually, Alberta has a pretty flat socioeconomic, with the big difference being home education, and that's pretty simple. Is you're obviously a one income family most of the time if you're home educated, but otherwise pretty flat socioeconomic status between systems. Whereas in a place like Ontario, you have a gigantic gap. And so anyway, and that's led to a very excellent system in terms of the types of things that are very easily measured. I think what the pandemic did was, because we were all on Zoom in the classroom with our kids, I think a lot of parents got a front row seat to some of the more unmeasurable parts of the system, and didn't like what they saw. So we did see a big shift to independent schooling or private schooling. I can just use the word private. Alberta, I think, is the only place that uses the independent terminology. But anyway, we saw a big increase in private, and fortunately, the charter school system was ready to expand significantly as well. So we still have twice as many people on waiting lists as seats, but we do have a lot more seats. So now 11% of Alberta's student population is in charter schools, which is a huge expansion. I think at the beginning of the pandemic, I think it's 6%.
Wow.
So we've had almost a doubling of the charter school population. We've had almost at first it was a doubling. I think the in-migration from other provinces has made the percentage go down, but the raw numbers in independent schools or the private schools haven't gone down. And so at first it was a doubling in terms of and there was a doubling of home education. And that's gone down, I think. About 70% of the people who started home educating during the pandemic have stuck with it, which is great. That's a really good number.
I think it's always good to have choice, right? Like, and have, parents be able, if that's what they choose for their family, to have access to that. So, if it's stuck with families after the pandemic, then that's amazing that they're able to do that, and that it's available to them to access too.
Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, I do think that's a big element where people have, it's not necessarily the schools are bad in some objective measure. It's just that, again, it's not, kids aren't one size fits all. Their education can't be either. They're seeing that, oh, this isn't quite what I thought it was. Let me try something else. And then we've even seen an explosion of something that's treated as extremely novel in the education sector, but probably sounds very familiar to you in the childcare sector. In the education sector, they call them micro schools or learning pods, small sometimes home-based, more commonly like church basement-based or
Mhm.
something like that, but or top of a recreation center based
Yeah.
or whatever. And but where you have almost no administration, and you'll have two teachers, 10 kids, or something like that. And but the point being that you've just got to really, the part of the appeal is that it's really small, and it really is just a relative handful of students and a teacher. And we've even seen a lot of that happening. Again,
Okay.
because of the regulation environment in
Yeah.
Alberta, not as much as other places like Arizona and Georgia.
Mhm.
In Arizona, they give, I think it's 7,500 American to even to these low regulation type learning pods. And they mostly call them micro schools.
Okay. So
And
does that mean like the funding follows the child then to whatever
funding,
they choose, right?
exactly.
Okay.
And in Arizona, that dollar amount for the voucher, that's, they call it an education say or an empowerment savings account. Sorry, is what
Yeah.
I think they call it, an empowerment scholarship account, actually. Anyway, they always like having the acronym ESA, but it stands for different things in different states. I think in Arizona it stands for an empowerment scholarship account
Okay.
that follows the child. So it's 7,500 American, which I don't know is like 70 million Canadian. Just but anyway, and that's still cheaper. I think the public school students are costing about $13,000 American per student. So Arizona spends a lot more than we do in Alberta on their public schools. But then they have this scholarship account that can follow the child to anything they choose, including a micro school. And they're more likely to call them a micro school in Arizona than here in Alberta, because the word school does not come with a mountain of regulation
Okay. Fair enough.
in Arizona like it does here. I believe the private school regulation in Arizona is, roughly speaking, you must have a fixed address, you must have air conditioning, since after all this is Arizona.
Yeah.
End of regulation. Whereas in Alberta, again, it's every bit as regulated as a public school. So
Yeah.
it's a lot more onerous to call yourself a school in that context. But
Yeah.
anyway, so we've seen a proliferation of that even in Alberta, this sort of hybrid type model.
Do you think that if funding were to follow, like truly follow the child, like in Arizona, do you see that, like you're talking about wait lists, and we are in childcare live in a huge mess of wait lists right now. What do you see that doing for accessibility if that was an option?
It would instantly increase accessibility. So, and that's what we've seen is, often when because I've watched these debates happening in the US, because the US model typically has been public school only. Like
Mhm.
no, there has been essentially no school choice or no educational freedom in the states. So I've watched individual states have this debate, and they will frequently, the argument will frequently be, well, where is anyone going to go in the, in the rural areas in particular?
Mhm.
Where is anyone going to go? There are no private schools out here. There are
Yeah.
no, and then sure enough, they allow for the money to follow the child, and all of a sudden there are private schools
Yeah.
everywhere. And
Yeah.
and if you need an example of that in Canada, I would look to marijuana legalization.
Mm-hmm.
Where 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 are you going to buy pot in Brooks? Well, you know what? You throw it open, get the government out of the way.
Yeah.
Whether you whether you love pot legalization or not, you have to you have to admit that
Yeah.
when the government got out of the way and threw it open and let it happen, you've got cannabis stores everywhere. All of a sudden, very available legally
Yeah.
all over the place. And that's the kind of thing that you see happening when you let the money follow the child in an education space. You'd see the same thing in a
And
childcare space, of
you know
course.
what? I own a private childcare center, a for-profit childcare center. So I definitely have opinions on this narrative that has come through this $10 a day program. that somehow a public system, a nonprofit system, breeds better quality, breeds better innovation. It is just the only way. A one size fits all, right, is what we're promoting under $10 a day. And I think, like you mentioned it in the beginning a little bit about your association and, the importance of competition and what that brings. And I think your analogy with like the marijuana stores, not that childcare is a marijuana store, but I think that, we need to, I think our government needs to start respecting that parents have critical thinking. They do know best for their child. They have values for their family, that's what they're looking for in childcare and education. You're going to be in alignment with what they value as a family and what their child needs at that time. And I think that if you had an open system, again, a free market in childcare or in education, where the funding is actually truly for the family and for their choice and follows their child, you would not, it would not breed this greedy for-profit industry that, this corporate industry that we're all being like fear-mongered against. What would happen is you would see a just diverse dynamic of childcare. You would see niche programs, you would see things that, pop up for families that need them in those communities. And like you said, in rural communities, that's been the argument in childcare too, that we have these childcare deserts and that only the nonprofits can come in and save them because, for-profit operators won't go there. Well, they will if there's a free market, if there's competition, if they're, if they have the space and they're not forced out. And I think that has been the biggest flaw with this federal system for childcare, is that we have government dictating that a one-size-fits-all nonprofit childcare is the only way and that anything else is bad. And, I think there's room for everyone. And as a parent, I like my choice for my children. I appreciate that I do have knowledge of what these children need and that I should be able to find it in that space, right? And, we moved from BC to Alberta, and my children weren't school aged when we moved here, but I worked in the school system in BC. So I had some knowledge of like public school systems, and I really value Alberta's public school system. I think like what I saw here, just even I'd say like innovation inside the schools in Alberta and what's available to children for programs and all these extra things. Like we don't have charter schools. So to see those kind of like niche programs come up in charter schools as options that were still publicly funded, I guess, or accessible, didn't cost the parents extra, I think is such a testament to Alberta, because you have so many different choices and there are so many amazing things and programs available. I hope that we can keep it going, right? And keep like I'm happy to hear that you're saying like charter schools have increased spaces and the wait lists aren't as long, because again, if you can't access something, you don't have a choice, right? So
the wait lists are just as long, but that's that there are more kids in them. So it's
yes.
just that there's even more demand. So that's,
yes. Yeah.
We're still headed in the right direction in that regard.
Yeah. I think we're underestimating the demand that is like coming into Alberta, right? This Alberta Calling campaign has been hugely successful. And I think, like I know in childcare, where we're looking at what the demand is in areas, it's stats from 2 to 3 years ago. And I mean, we live in South Calgary, and I can tell you that what was here 3 years ago is completely different than what's here now. Like the amount of build and new communities and new families with children coming here. So, I think that's something we need to take into account too, right? When we're planning communities and supports for families. So
yeah, absolutely. And again, the goal of the reason we have this taxation of people with children and without children is because we have as a society decided that the value there is that we all benefit from children being educated. That's the argument. The same argument has been applied to childcare, that we all benefit from parents being able to access the workforce, that we all benefit from children being in safe environments, et cetera, et cetera. And so if that's the argument, then what we're saying is that the reason we're paying taxes on these things is so that the child will be educated, so that the child will be cared for.
Yeah.
it's not to prop up a particular system, a particular approach. It's to what we're paying for is for children to be educated, for children to be cared for, not for a particular sector within that space to become dominant.
Mm-hmm.
And
what we see a lot, what I've continued to ask when I attend meetings with politicians and policymakers under this umbrella is, where are the children in all of this? Like, we continue to talk about all of the things that we need to do to save childcare, to do this for Canadians, but where are the children in these conversations? Because what we're seeing this week, I'll just say there's been some change, I think, politically across the country. A lot of the cracks are starting to show 3 years into our childcare program. The accessibility is not there. Parents can't actually access these $10 spaces. There's starting to be some, I think, awareness that it's not maybe all it was promised. And we're seeing other, premiers from other provinces ask for private expansion because they're recognizing that one part of the sector cannot support the whole sector, and that we need to be dynamic and we need to have variety and work together to support families. It can't just be one. And I think that they're definitely being targeted by this narrative, by certain associations and lobbyists and policymakers, because that's not what they want to hear. That doesn't support this $10 narrative. And I think that's such a mistake, because you have a premier that knows the province, that works for the families in that province, and can see firsthand that they can't access it. I mean, in Ontario, there's an 8 to 9 year wait list for a $10 a day childcare space. Like, how is that acceptable? And then you have the premier or the minister in Ontario asking for support from the private sector. Let the private sector come in and help these families. And that's being scrutinized. But how is an 8 or 9 year wait list somehow a success for this program? Like, I think that we need to remove the politics out of this and go back to why we're here. And that is to support children and families in their education. And, like you had said in the beginning, parents know best. Listen to parents. If you're in a province like Alberta, where 67% of your childcare is in private spaces, that's because parents are making that choice. They don't have to. There's before this program, there was lots of options. So I think, it's just, we just got to go back to like the root of this, which is to educate our children, to support our families. And I mean, with that, you don't have to worry about the rest, because it flows naturally when you have an educated, supported society. And I'm so frustrated with this narrative, right?
Well, and yeah, the idea that you say, like, where did we lose the kids in all this? When you let things become really centralized and really bureaucratized, there is that tendency where some of the easiest things to see are, how much money are we spending on this? And one of the easier things to see is, how many adults is this employing?
Mm-hmm.
And so it becomes more about ultimately the taxation and the job program for adults than about kids.
Yeah.
and we definitely see that in education, where you'll have entire debates about education that are entirely focused on the concerns of the adults employed by the system.
Yeah.
Whether that be the politicians, who I consider, especially school board trustee is employed by the system, obviously, but an MLA is employed by the system. So, or whether that be the union heads in the ATA, or frontline teachers, administrators, the entire debate will center around the concerns of the adults employed by the system, without much attention to how does this affect the kids. That, after all, the point of the education system is supposed to be to educate children, not to give jobs to adults. And it certainly seems to me that we've seen a parallel sort of thing happening in childcare since the federal government takeover, where the the debate has the center of the debate has just shifted that little bit more, and it happens gradually and then all at once, right? Where the center of the debate shifts more and more away from the kids this is meant to help.
Yeah. And then, what I find too is that I think it's been our federal government and people that are employed under this childcare system and have a stake in it being successful have really withheld, or there's been a lot of information that just is not out there for families to see the success. And there's been some really good Stats Canada reports since this program was released. We have less women in the workforce now than we did prior to this program. Less children have access to childcare than we did prior to this program. And those are the two, big agendas for this program, is to bring people into the workforce and give people more access. Well, you're failing. And you've already invested $30 billion federally, not to mention what each province is putting forward. And that's not even enough. Like, that is not enough money to fund a fully public system across the country. So again, who's engaging with the parents about this system as it's being built? Who's engaging with the taxpayers about the system that they're paying for when the stats are not showing that it's been successful and we're already 3 years in? And I think it's just, again, such a shameful use of public funds and such a shameful way to respect families and parents and the children that this whole thing is supposed to be about. It's just.
Well, and I've also heard from and so, for one thing, my understanding is that we shouldn't be surprised that there are fewer women in the workforce, since that is what happened in Quebec.
Yeah. Well, this is modeled after Quebec, which has not been successful either. So, that's where I feel some days like I'm just like, am I in the same universe as this? Like, where am I right now that we are modeling a program after a program that failed? Like, Quebec failed in their public system of childcare and ended up having to invite the private sector back in because they can't support the families. You now have a two-tiered system there. It's a mess. And here we are modeling a whole national program on that. And not to mention that because childcare is a provincially jurisdiction, each province handles childcare so differently. And so to have one universal system roll out without an understanding of each provincial childcare system is a massive error too, because you can't do that. You can't come into Alberta where you had 67% for-profit childcare spaces and do the same thing that you might do in Manitoba where you have 4% for profit. It's a different market, and it's structured differently. So I think I don't know where this program came from. I'm personally thinking campaign promises and all of the political stuff that goes with holding a position. But I mean, we have a responsibility to Canadian families. This is something that's like education. A system, once it's built and in place, is not just going to go away overnight.
Right.
And it's going to take, I don't even know how many billions of dollars to fix this. And in years after this childcare system is rolled out, the access is just getting worse in Alberta and across the country. The red tape to open a childcare center, nonprofit or for-profit, if you can open a for-profit center, it's taking so long, probably 3 times as long as it did prior to this program. And you have families, I think one of the biggest things around choice too and access is that, if you don't have access, you actually have no choice. Because, I constantly hear from parents that are like, I won the lottery, I got a $10 a day childcare space. You shouldn't feel that way. This is your lottery. You bought these spaces, you paid for them. They should be accessible to you in a center that you choose, in a form of childcare that you choose, not in a form of childcare where you can hope to get a spot. Because if you go to your center or your form of care that you want, and there's 500 families in front of you, you have no choice. You're not getting in. And yeah, sorry, we're just in such a bad loop, right?
And you've pointed out before that it is the high socioeconomic status families that are in the front of the line, because they were on these waiting lists before, and they could and they could afford it. And we have a similar expression in the education is that the rich will always have choice in education.
Yeah.
Right? Is
Yeah.
that you're it's almost impossible to design a system that doesn't work for the very wealthy, and it's almost and so what's difficult is designing a system that that harnesses that wealth to raise all the boats. and in childcare, it's obvious, if you let the money follow the child, then you would have more access open up as entrepreneurs will respond to those incentives, and they will be able to provide more access, and that will and you're not it again, it doesn't matter much. The people at the very top of the socioeconomic spectrum we're always going to have their full range
Yeah.
of choices. But
Yeah.
then families like mine are now have access. My kids are able to go to a type of school that doesn't exist in most provinces. That it's a public alternative program that doesn't exist in most provinces. If it had to be a fully private school with no funding following the child, we couldn't afford it. But it opens up access to families like mine. And our school has seen a bunch of people come in from British Columbia and from Ontario and from Nigeria and Ghana and this year, who this was an option that just was not imaginable for them where they were coming from, but they have it here. And that's the kind of story that we see all the time in education, because Alberta lets some of the money follow the child, even just some of the money.
Yeah.
Again, the giant success story in Arizona, which I don't think I even fully got into. Arizona went from being, I think it was something like 48 out of 50 states in education to being 12th in 10 years because of this system, basically entirely because of the system of choice in education, because of money following the child.
Yeah.
The kids who advanced the most were the poorest kids, the most rural kids, and Indigenous kids were the ones who benefited the most from this. 95% of kids in Arizona have a charter school in their area. Iowa has had a similar expansion recently, and I think it's 98% of kids in Iowa have access to an independent private and in their area. So you have this vast expansion. I don't want to push this analogy too hard, but when the Iron Curtain fell, I can't remember if it was the mayor of Moscow said, okay, like, we understand. At some point we're going to have to privatize the provision of bread in some way, right? Maybe it's a voucher, but we're going to have to do something to sort of. So he invites people and he says, if you explain to me where the bread stores are going to be if we try this with some private, opening it up to some private provision of bread. Explain to me where the bread stores are going to be. And they're like, no, you misunderstand. We can't tell you where the bread stores are going to be. We just can tell you that there are going to be more of them. They're going to be of higher quality, that people aren't going to be waiting in bread lines. It turns out that every other country that does it differently than us here in the Soviet Union, every other country don't have bread lines. In outside of Soviet Russia, the bread line's up for you. We in childcare, in education, we need a little bit more of that. The bread lining up for you, kind of.
And your analogy, or your explanation about Arizona is such a success, because I think the whole purpose of these public systems, education, childcare, these care systems, is to give opportunity to everyone, right? To create like these opportunities within our society for people to break cycles, to elevate themselves for the next generation, to change some of the issues that we're having as a society. And With childcare right now across the country, 77% of those $10 a day spaces are held by people in the upper income levels. So it's not working. And it's so, you have people again, like the lower income families, the ones that are the ones who were told this was for them, have again no choice and no access. And it's again, we're just creating the same cycle, right? Like, so I hope we can, have some more bread stores in Alberta and maybe look to different places like Arizona and even just what what the education system is doing. Let's model things after what's working instead of, a system that failed and then had to be bailed out and all of those things.
I think we've got a very similar, very similar situation. It's newer in the childcare space, so the pain feels fresher and it's a very, very similar situation where if we recognize that the money is for the kids, the money should follow the kids. that it's not about which adults in which kind of system get employed by this. It's about making sure that kids are cared for, kids are educated, that's the goal of all this. That's what people were told that this was for. We were told that it would be access for everyone, and that it would improve everyone's choices, free people up to make choices about their employment in the case of childcare. And when there's too much centralization and bureaucratization, it sort of strangles out that original promise of the system. So yeah, the money should follow the child. Parents are the real experts. Their children aren't one size fits all. So their spaces, the options for them can't be one size fits all either. If we let the money follow the child, trust the parents, trust the and trust the professionals. The professionals in either of these spaces are not getting into it because even if they're officially for profit, they're not getting into it because they saw an opportunity to make a bunch of money. Everyone gets into this because they care about kids and they want to make sure that kids are getting absolutely the best possible care, the best possible education. And so if we can, and of course you need basic safety guidelines and basic and all that. And it is ultimately, you also need who has the freedom here is important. It's ultimately parents have the freedom to choose the provider they want and to have informed consent into that, and to be able to, it's not ultimately freedom for a provider to do whatever they want. You're talking about other people's children after all. and so keeping that at the center, making sure parents are empowered with more information, making sure parents are empowered with more choices. That's the approach in both of these places, and it will lead to much better outcomes than trying to centrally plan from the top where to put the bread lines.
Yeah, exactly. That's so well said. Is there anything that we can direct, anyone watching this to support your association? I saw you have a petition on your website, which is albertaparentsunion.ca. Do you want to just maybe close with a little bit about that, and let's get some other parents on there and signing? Because I think I know I signed it yesterday, and I think it's really valid and really important to add our names to that.
Yeah, absolutely. So so at albertaparentsunion.ca, under the action tab, you'll find all of our active petitions, and it's getting to be quite a few. But our active campaign right now is called Stand Up to the ATA on Assessments. So the ATA is the Alberta Teachers Association. It's the teacher union. In Alberta, we only have one teacher union. I know other provinces have it differently, and they came out, as I mentioned earlier, in opposition to parents getting this information about how their kids are doing, their very youngest kids. So there'll be, I'm sure, some overlap with your listeners, because we're talking about kindergarten through grade 5 is what these assessments apply to. And it's just to make sure that kids are on track with reading and math in those earliest, where those are absolutely the foundational skills that everything else builds off of. And so just to make sure that kids have those skills nailed down, that they're making good progress in those skills at the earliest ages, so that we know that there's a problem long before it manifests in all the work falling apart. And so that's the idea. And the previous system, there were assessments, but that was kind of all over the map. It differed very, very much from school division to school division and so forth. And so it's a more, and that's very empowering to parents, because if we do exercise our choices and move from one school authority to another, we can know this kind of assessment happens here everywhere, and we can have those expectations of the kind of information that we're going to get back. And so we very strongly felt that this was a good move in opposition to Teachers Association in our province. So this is our active campaign right now. It's getting up towards 3,600 signatures, so that's going quite well. And it's as we speak, it's been 1 week and 1 day. So it's been 8 days that this campaign has been live, and we're headed towards 3,600 signatures as we speak. So 4 away as we speak. So it's definitely going well. We've gotten some really good feedback on that. A lot of parents telling us that they find this very important. A lot of engagement, and it's July as we speak. I don't know when this is coming out, but it's July as we speak. So in the middle of summer vacations for a lot of families, but we've still gotten a lot of interest in this. So that's been really great. But you can see from that action tab, you can see sort of the range of things that we've been advocating on, and from the news tab, you can see that. But if you're in Alberta, or you're just interested in the policy in Alberta and how that might apply to your province, then you can sign up for our mailing list. That's on the front page at albertaparentsunion.ca. Sign up for our mailing list. Make sure to be getting those updates from us. And we try to, we only send an email when we have something to say, but we try to have something to say every week, so that we're keeping people up to date and informed on what's happening in the education system here in Alberta.
Thank you so much, Jeff. Thank you for joining us on today's journey through the heart of Canada's childcare sector. We hope you found inspiration, insight, and a call to action that resonates with you. But our conversation doesn't end here. The quest for high-quality childcare is ongoing, and your voice is essential in this collective journey. Stay connected and continue to be part of this crucial dialogue by following Voices for Care on your favorite podcast platform. Subscribe to receive updates on new episodes, and share with friends and family to broaden our community of advocates. Together, we can make a difference in the lives of children and families across Canada. Don't forget to reach out via our social media channels with your thoughts, stories, and ideas for future episodes. Your input helps shape our mission and the future of childcare in our country. Until next time, keep raising your voice for care, because every child deserves a bright start, and every parent is entitled to the choice and care for their family. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode of Voices for Care.